Today we pick up with the war at home in the U.S. during World War I. Wilson is going to get the okay from Congress to go to war after the Zimmerman Note was revealed to us. And his priority is going to be to mobilize the entire economy to get us ready to go into war, because we were really not that ready to begin with. And so he is going to get consumer good factories to turn into weapons factories, to turn into uniform factories, ammunition factories, all kinds of stuff to get us ready for engagement in this war. And so Wilson is going to be given control by Congress to fix prices and to regulate the industries to make sure that we are all working together towards this end. So he's going to create something called the War Industries Board, and the War Industries Board had the powers to regulate efficiency and to standardize parts, allocate materials, and to set quotas of what the expectation was for each industry of what they should be producing for the war effort. Now, some of the side effects of this is kind of interesting. We get better uses for what at the time were considered fashionable items. Like women prior to World War I were still wearing corsets, and these corsets would have steel structures in them to keep them in shape into the hourglass figure that was so desirable. Well, with the war effort, they need all the steel they can get. So women are going to basically make a fashion change and say, we're no longer wearing these because we want the steel to go towards making ships or to make bullets or whatever, to make tanks, all kinds of stuff. So another good example would be women used to wear like mid-calf boots as their everyday shoe wear. And again, they'll make a fashion change that we only need an ankle length. And so that extra leather can be put towards making soldiers' boots or making leather straps for the uniform and for guns and that kind of thing. Their dresses will also change. That women prior to World War I, it was considered improper for you to see a woman's ankles, and so her dress was very long, almost floor length. But during World War I, their hemlines are going to rise to almost, not quite to the knee, but almost to the knee, because that extra material could be used for making bandages or to put towards making clean shirts and all kinds of stuff that could be used for the war effort. So fashion itself is going to change as a result of World War I. Another effect of it is that the government's going to encourage people to conserve fuel, because then that fuel could be sent over to our troops that need it in the field. Remember, the machine guns ran on gasoline, so they need that. So they're trying to encourage people to go with gasless Sundays or lightless nights. And daylight savings time will also be introduced during this time, that people could better utilize the longer days of summer, even though they weren't really longer. They're just using the daylight hours more effectively, and be using less fuel to light the darker night hours when they would be working. So they would work more towards the actual daylight hours. The war economy itself, wages will rise in some industries, like the shipping industry is going to see some rises. The metalworking industry will see rises in prices. The Food Administration will be created, and Herbert Hoover, and this is before he becomes president, is going to be put in charge of the Food Administration, and it's going to look at rationing of food in the U.S. in order to conserve. That was the big push, was to conserve at home so that we could send more to our troops overseas. And the Food Administration is going to come out with a couple ideas. The first is the gospel of the clean plate. The idea that if you have too much of stuff, you waste it. And we don't want to waste. We want to conserve. And so one day would be set aside as meatless, that you would have no meat on that day. 2 days would be set aside as wheatless, so no wheat used in the making of your meal. 2 days porkless, or 1 day sweetless, all kinds of things that they looked to conserve that fuel, to conserve whatever they could, the food. Victory gardens are also going to be promoted, and victory gardens are where you would grow your own veggies so you don't take away from those that could be sent over to the soldiers. Again, a very, very patriotic ideal that you are helping to create a victory in Europe by having your own victory garden, so that way you are growing your own food rather than taking away from a soldier who could use it and need it more than you. Women in the workforce are also going to increase because a lot of the men had to leave to go fight. And so women began filling their roles in the factories and in their jobs in order to not only keep an income coming into their households, but also to sort of reserve that spot for their loved one. Selling the war was a big thing. Wars are expensive. You need money to wage a war. And so the US government's going to promote patriotism, and they're also going to try and manufacture hate, that you're doing this not only because it's patriotic, but also because you hate the enemy, sort of thing. And so financing this war is going to be somewhat difficult. They will raise the income taxes. That's not always that popular. They'll also raise taxes on tobacco and liquor and luxury goods, but they also are going to sell war bonds. And this was considered kind of a safer way to get money because you're feeding off people's patriotic belief that they're doing the right thing. They're doing it for their boys overseas. There's also a big public info campaign that will take place that is going to promote the war through posters and paintings and cartoons, booklets and pamphlets and sculptures, all kinds of stuff that helps to explain why we're fighting in this war, what the meaning of America is, why we needed to ration what we were eating, why did we have a draft, why plant victory gardens, and also just to try and increase morale and keep the U.S. people behind our troops and supporting them. During this time, however, we also see an increase in wartime paranoia. Paranoia is where you're afraid of what other people are thinking or seeing about you. And so what we're going to see is an increase in anti-immigrant hysteria that it was especially targeted against the Germans as well as Austria-Hungary, but mostly the Germans. Immigrants who came over to the U.S., no matter when, if they knew that you had German in your background, there was some fear that you were going to taint the American society because Germany was seen as the instigator of this war. Towns will change their names. Americans with German-sounding last names lose their jobs. So like my name, Schubert, very much a German name. I could potentially lose my job in World War I because my name sounded too German. They were worried about how I might influence young minds. German composers would not be played. They stopped teaching the German language in schools. Libraries would remove German authors and their books. And kind of the funny part of it is that they changed anything German to liberty, whatever. So like the German chocolate cake became the Liberty chocolate cake. The German measles became the Liberty measles. The German shepherd became the Liberty shepherd. So it was kind of like your coverall to everything and make sure it looks nice and pretty. We can't call it German anything. So kind of an interesting thing. The second part of that is not so funny. It's the Espionage and Sedition Acts. And in 1917, the Espionage Act was passed. And this is kind of understandable because you didn't want anybody spying on the U.S. and revealing what we were doing. So the Espionage Act kind of makes sense. But in 1918, the Sedition Act is passed. And the Sedition Act said that if you were interfering with the draft, or you were obstructing the sale of government bonds, or you were saying anything that was disloyal or abusive about the government or about the war effort, you could be fined up to $100,000, which is a lot of money at that time, and you could serve up to 20 years in jail. Well, 6,000 people are going to be arrested. 1,500 of them will be convicted, and really for no reason, because here in the U.S. you have something called the First Amendment, which means that you can say that you don't agree with the war effort. You can say that the government's doing the wrong thing. You have that ability. That's your First Amendment right. And so the Espionage Act, understandable. Sedition Act is going to tweak at what was actually legal for the government to restrict people from doing during wartime. Kind of an interesting thing. Social changes will also take place on the home front. African Americans, their opinions on the war were somewhat divided. Not all of them are going to support the war effort because they're going to say, why are we supporting a racist government? This government doesn't support us, but all of a sudden now it wants to make the world safe for democracy? Where's our democracy? We don't have free right. We don't have civil rights. We don't have equal access to things. Others are going to say, no, we should support the government in the war because that's going to establish ties with the government. They're going to see that we were supportive of them. And in return, when they get home, they're going to get rid of racial injustice. They're going to make our lives better because they're going to see how we contributed and how we supported them. Also during this time period, we're going to see something called the Great Migration take place. And the Great Migration was this large-scale movement of Southern blacks to northern cities. And there's several factors behind this. The first is obviously the racial discrimination that was very prevalent in the South is going to be a big factor in this. But also they were having some agricultural difficulties in the South. They had this thing called a boll weevil. And a boll weevil, B-O-L-L-W-E-E-V-I-L, is a bug, and it infests the cotton crop. And so a lot of African Americans who were struggling in the South end up dirt poor. They lose everything because of this boll weevil infestation. And so they move north in order to find a job. And that leads into the third one. And the third reason, or the third factor, is that there were greater job opportunities in the North. There just were more jobs available because of the industry that was going on in the North and all that stuff. And the fourth problem, or the fourth factor, is the fact that in the South, there was still a lot of lynching going on. And lynching is an illegal killing of people without a trial. And so that was a huge issue, a huge problem that was going on in the South. And so you escaped it by going to the North. However, because so many were moving to the North and going into crowded cities to find jobs and to find a better life, that new problems are going to be created. There's going to be huge overcrowding, and they start creating ghetto areas. And that's going to cause a problem. Because of the overcrowding, you get the second new problem, which is higher rent. Less space means that it's going to cost more to live there because there's not very much available. The third new problem is just the resentment of the whites in the North, because here you have these blacks coming up and they're kind of undercutting the jobs. They're taking all the jobs because they get paid less than whites do, and so they're going to be hired over white people. Another social change that comes during this time period is for women. Women are going to gain new social roles because a lot of jobs open up to women at this time period because there's not men to do it. The men are overseas fighting. And so things like delivery truck drivers or railroad workers, bricklayers, coal miners, all these jobs are going to open up to women because they need to have this income, and these are jobs that need to get done, and there's not men to do them. However, women at this time did not receive equal pay for equal work. But after the war, they do gain their suffrage. They do gain the right to vote in 1919. Another major event, or the last major event that's going to take place at home, is this huge epidemic. There is a flu epidemic that breaks out in 1918. And this epidemic basically comes from France, from the soldiers who were returning home from France. And they had gotten it from Chinese shipyard workers. And eventually, all these soldiers are coming home from France to either recuperate or whatever, and they're bringing this disease home with them, and it ends up becoming this international problem. About 1/4 of the U.S. population is going to be affected by this flu. It had symptoms of high fever and headaches and aching muscles, and if it wasn't treated appropriately, if it wasn't treated properly, it would lead to pneumonia. And pneumonia can kill you. And especially if you don't seek medical advice or seek a medical treatment, you're going to die. And Americans do die. About 500,000 Americans die due to the flu epidemic of 1918. Worldwide, you're going to see about 51 million die. So it has a huge impact on not only fighting force, but industry and workers and all kinds of stuff.